Osowiec was not the kind of fortress a person remembers at first sight. It did not stand on a high cliff, did not reflect in a river like something from an old legend, did not raise elegant towers toward the sky as if they had been destined to outlive centuries. Its beauty, if there was any beauty in it at all, lay elsewhere, in harsh necessity, in stubborn usefulness, in that severe restraint that belongs to things created not to inspire admiration, but to serve a purpose. It stood among marshes, damp earth, mists, and lowlands, where the land itself seemed less like solid ground than a slow, sticky resistance to any movement. And yet it is precisely in such places that history sometimes speaks the loudest. On a map, Osowiec might have seemed like nothing more than a point, one among many, an unnoticed fortification on the edge of a vast front that, month after month, devoured new stretches of land, cities, villages, railroads, and human lives. But in wartime, the importance of a place is not measured by how famous it is, but by what passes through it. Through Osowiec, time itself passed. And in war, time is often more valuable than blood. The fortress covered an important direction, delayed the enemy, forced him to stop where he had hoped to move quickly, and drained his strength where he had expected to preserve it for the next blow. For the Russian army, Osowiec was a lock on a door that could not be thrown open too soon. For the Germans, it was a splinter in the flesh of their advance, a heavy and irritating obstacle that could not simply be bypassed, because it would go on living behind their backs, threatening supply lines, communications, and the very confidence of the attacker. But a fortress does not exist by itself. Stone, concrete, timber, earth, wire, embrasures, batteries, casemates, all of it is dead until a human being comes to dwell inside. That is why the story of Osowiec is not the story of walls. It is the story of the people who were forced to live inside those walls for so long that the walls themselves became an extension of their exhaustion, their will, and their doomed endurance. Life inside a fortress is rarely what people imagine if they have never heard the air tremble overhead from a heavy shell. In the mind of a civilian, a fortress seems like a refuge. Thick walls, interior chambers, supplies, guns, all of it seems to promise at least some shelter from chaos. In reality, a fortress at war is not a refuge, but a form of permanent tension. Here, you do not hide from danger. You live alongside it, sleep beside it, eat in its presence, wake beneath its breath. Osowiec breathed dampness. It was everywhere, in the stone, in the soil, in the timber beams, in boots, in tunics, in blankets, in bread, in the air itself. Nothing here was ever truly dry. Everything felt slightly heavier than it should have been. A rifle, heavier. A coat, heavier. The body itself, heavier. Morning brought no relief, because the dampness survived the night together with the men, and at dawn it settled onto their shoulders once again. The garrison of Osowiec lived in that sticky reality day after day. The soldiers did not merely stand guard, they constantly kept the fortress alive. The damaged had to be repaired, the weak reinforced, the guns checked, the ammunition watched, the positions maintained, the communications observed, the sentries rotated, the reports carried, the equipment moved, the readiness inspected, and then everything had to begin again. Repair, haul, wait, repeat. In war, a fortress is held not by the thickness of its walls, but by unceasing human labor. A wall no one maintains is already half breached. And there was one more thing that wore men down no less than battle itself. Waiting. Waiting for bombardment. Waiting for an assault. Waiting for the enemy's next attempt to break what he had failed to break yesterday. Anyone who has never lived through a siege rarely understands how destructive the intervals between attacks can be. In those hours and days, a man can neither truly relax nor truly act. He exists in suspension. He eats quickly, sleeps shallowly, speaks more quietly than usual, listens to distant sounds, learns from the faintest trembling in the air what kind of gun might be firing somewhere beyond the marshes. Little by little, his hearing begins to live apart from him. Every creak, every distant rumble, every vibration in the stone wall is no longer just a sound, but a question. Is it beginning again? That was how they lived in Osowiec. Not as bronze heroes already doomed to glory, but as ordinary military men who wanted warmth, proper sleep, dry clothing, silence, home, and at least one day without that sticky sensation of an oncoming blow. They froze, grew irritable, grew tired, became angry, fell ill, cursed, waited for letters, longed for civilian life, and perhaps at times hated both the enemy and the war, and even the fortress itself, which had become their entire world. But it is precisely such people who most often carry history on their shoulders. Not those who already resemble monuments, but those who remain human for too long, and still keep doing what must be done. The Germans could not take Osowiec quickly, not because it was invulnerable. By that war, invulnerable fortresses no longer existed. The First World War had already taught Europe that concrete cracks, earth is turned inside out, and stone, however thick, ceases under heavy artillery to be a symbol of eternity. But between the words "not invulnerable" and "will collapse quickly" lies an enormous, almost bottomless difference. Osowiec lived inside that difference. It was pounded by heavy artillery, ranged in on, pressed, tested for the place where it would waver, where a weak point would open, where the garrison would fail and yield not so much to force as to exhaustion. The German command worked methodically. It did not demand that the fortress collapse at once. It sought to ensure that each new day reduced its ability to resist. That is the art of siege warfare, not one beautiful blow, but a slow, systematic wearing down. And yet the fortress lived. Its ceilings crumbled, the earth on its positions was torn open, stones splintered, boards cracked, the air thickened with powder dust and smoke. And still Osowiec did not fall silent. It answered. It held the line. It continued to exist as a military organism, and so it took from the enemy the thing most precious to him, the ease of advance. War especially hates what refuses to break on schedule. So little by little the fortress and the siege itself grew beyond their immediate military meaning. To some, Osowiec became an irritation. To others, a familiar and almost grim meaning of daily life. The garrison no longer merely defended the fortification. It lived inside its slow fate. The summer of 1915 brought a new form of horror. By then the war had already lost almost all its old illusions. It had ceased to be a clash of armies in the older sense, and had become more and more a giant machine of systematic destruction. Artillery, machine guns, engineering works, deep defenses, gas, all of this had already become part of a new language of death. Gas was perhaps the most revolting word in that new language. A bullet kills quickly. A fragment tears the body, and however terrible that is to say, remains a recognizable weapon. But gas does something else. It makes the air itself hostile, the very thing a person assumes is his by absolute right from birth. As long as there is air, one is still alive. Gas takes away not merely breath, it takes away the sense of the world as a place where life is even possible. When the Germans decided to use chlorine against Osowiec, it was not merely one more means of pressure. It was an attempt to do what artillery had not managed to do in the needed measure, not only to destroy the fortifications, but to destroy man's very ability to remain in the ranks. The morning of August 6, 1915, resembled many other mornings of war. Damp air, the low heaviness of the earth, an early light in which things had not yet fully taken shape. Yet such hours are often the most terrible, because the world has not yet completely become day, and horror enters it all the more deeply. A cloud of chlorine moved toward the Russian positions. It did not fly or stream. It crawled. Low, thick, green-yellow, heavy, as though the earth itself were exhaling poison. The chlorine moved into the places where a man ordinarily feels safest: trenches, hollows, depressions, the places where one hides from bullets and fragments. Everything that had yesterday still been protection now turned into a trap. Vegetation died almost at once in the path of the gas. Leaves blackened, grass collapsed. The air itself came to resemble a disease, something hostile to life. For a human being, it was worse still. The eyes burned as if fire had been poured into them. The throat became a wound. The lungs no longer served breathing. They seemed to begin melting from within. Coughing tore at the chest, made breath impossible, and blood and mucus rose to the lips. Suffocation did not come as an instant death, but as the agonizing realization that the very act of breathing had become torture. Anyone who has never endured a gas attack can scarcely imagine how quickly a man ceases to be a soldier and becomes a creature for whom the entire universe shrinks to one purpose alone: to take the next breath. That was the calculation. After such a blow, the defense was meant not merely to weaken, but to vanish as a living force. That was what the Germans expected. They were certain that after the gas, the forward edge of the defense would either be wiped out or so paralyzed that all that remained was to occupy the positions and finish what had been started. Everything looked logical. Everything matched the capabilities of the weapon. Everything pointed to one conclusion: resistance should have choked to death. But war is terrible because sometimes, inside its darkest logic, something arises that can no longer be called calculation alone. Men began to rise out of the gas cloud, out of the shattered positions, out of the space where silence should already have reigned. They were alive. And yet they resembled those whom war itself had almost crossed off its ledger. Their faces were burned, their eyes inflamed, their bandages soaked with blood, coughing ripped through their bodies, breathing had become torment, and their lips, mouths, and throats all bore the marks of chlorine. By every law of war, these men should already have been out of the fight. But they rose, they took up rifles, they moved forward. Later, this would be called the attack of the dead men. It is a powerful, terrible phrase, almost ready-made for legend. But the most horrifying truth of that episode is that there was no mysticism in it. These were not dead men. They were mortally poisoned, broken, burned men who nevertheless kept advancing. That was more terrible to the enemy than any fiction. The German infantry expected to see the consequences of gas, silence, emptiness, the remains of a shattered defense. Instead, out of the smoke and chlorine, there came toward them something that should no longer have been there. Not from the point of view of later legend, but from the point of view of human psychology, it was a blow of immense force. In war, a man prepares himself for death, for fire, for resistance, but it is especially hard for him to endure what breaks the already established picture of the world. The Germans advanced certain that before them lay a dying line of defense. What they saw instead was a counterattack. That was the turning point that made Osowiec something more than a fortress. Panic does not arise only from fear of force. Very often it arises from collision with something that should no longer be able to act. When an enemy you have already internally recorded among the dead suddenly rises and comes toward you, not only the formation collapses, confidence itself collapses, confidence in control over what is happening. The Germans began to retreat, in some places sharply, in others in disorder, in still others in that nervous confusion which is always born when an advance suddenly ceases to be an advance and becomes an attempt to escape what one never expected to see. And yet even here, one must not allow legend to eclipse the rest of the truth. The attack of the dead men was not a miracle that sprang from emptiness. It became possible only because before it there had been months of fortress life, siege, discipline, exhaustion, heavy daily labor, and a habit of living under attack and still doing one's duty. Without that long inner hardening, There would have been no terrible hour in which a man, already nearly destroyed, nevertheless rose to meet the enemy. That is why Osowiec cannot be reduced to a single episode. Osowiec is the marshes through which movement is difficult, the walls that crack but do not fall at once, the garrison in whom no romance remained, but stubbornness did, the fortress that does not look majestic and yet becomes more important than many majestic places, the air turned into a weapon, and the men who keep breathing even when breathing itself has become suffering. Later the fortress would be abandoned, but not because it was finally and spectacularly taken after the gas attack. Military logic is broader and harsher than any beautiful climax. When the overall front changes, when the strategic situation forces a withdrawal, even the strongest fortress loses its former meaning. It may be evacuated not because it lost its inner battle, but because the war itself has moved on. So it was with Osowiec. It fulfilled its task. It delayed, tied down, forced the enemy to pay in time and nerves, and refused to let him pass as quickly as he had wished. But history no longer released it. Memory rarely keeps what was merely useful. It keeps what shook the very boundary of human ideas about the possible. Osowiec was remembered not only as a fortress, not only as an episode of the First World War, not only as a point on a map. It became an image of how far a human being can go in the fulfillment of duty when the air itself has risen against him. That is why the story outlived the war. Not because it has a beautiful name, not because it is convenient for legend, but because behind it stands a real, heavy, damp, almost physically tangible truth. Osowiec is not a story about immortality. It is a story about a limit, about the limit of a fortress they tried to erase, about the limit of a war that decided it could strangle men with the air itself, and about the limit of a human being who, already almost unable to breathe, still found within himself the strength to take one more step. That is why Osowiec remains in memory, not as merely a military fortification, not as a line in a textbook, not as a single vivid scene, but as a place where war tried to take away from a man the simplest of all rights, the right to air, and still could not silence him at once. If you want, I can next make an even stronger version, entirely without any journalistic tone, and shape it fully like a fragment of a historical novel.